Now I'd like to welcome our expert panel for this week. In New York, Irina Zuckerman, and in Washington, D.C., Behnam bin Taleblu, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you both for joining us today. So, Ms. Zuckerman, we'll start with you. What is Russia hiding when it comes to the use of drones?
Unfortunately, it's not hiding anything. On the contrary, the entire time, Russia has been fairly open about its willingness to cooperate with Iran. It has been brazen in doing so. And over time, we have seen that the level of cooperation has increased. We are seeing that from supplying mere drones that can easily be shut down by civilians on the street, Iran is now getting ready to and sending its Shahid missiles and other types of missiles, air-to-surface missiles, and it is actually going into, Iran is sending advisors to train the Russians in Crimea on the proper use of missiles. So Russia has put itself into a position of dependency on Iran, but at the same time it is benefiting greatly from that relationship, despite the fact that it shows its own vulnerability in lack of its own weapons that it can use, and the fact that it needs training from Iranians in that respect.
Yes, Behnam, on to you. Looking from Tehran, obviously there is money, obviously there is cooperation with Moscow, but at the same time there is a very, very brutal breach of all sanctions and big no-nos forced by UN and other big forces in the West when Iran is trying to reach a nuclear deal. So what's going on?
Well, you ended on a very critical point there, and it's a pleasure to be with you and your guest. But in essence, Iran is not really trying at the moment to reach a nuclear deal. We saw how they stonewalled and held up several good faith attempts by the Europeans and Americans earlier this August. In fact, they seem quite comfortable continuing to violate oil-based sanctions to have just enough illicit revenues to keep their illicit foreign and security policy afloat. And we're seeing now in real time, as the regime continues to, beyond 1 month now, engage in such domestic repression, they're widening the radius of their foreign aggression. The replicatable model, the playbook of sending men, money, munitions, advisors, weapons, drones, and potentially now ballistic missiles that was once limited to the Middle East is now reaching Central and Eastern Europe. And ultimately, Iran is using this as an opportunity to continue its larger ideological, political, and strategic war against the West. And it's also warming up to the American great power competitor here, the Russians. And over time, the more cooperation, the more collaboration there exists between Tehran and Moscow, the less space for the differences will be made, because they'll be shooting essentially at the same people.
But Behnam, Iran has been trying for nearly 20 years now to get away from what used to be called in 2003 by, at the time, President Bush, the axis of evil. It was trying to show its pretty face. By cooperating in such scale with the Russians in Ukraine, it is showing that Iran is in the center of the axis of evil, and there is no way out for it.
I'm very, very glad you mentioned this tried and true and somewhat old phrase, because I certainly think it deserves to be resurrected for a new axis here in the world that we're facing, or at least that liberal democracies or the Western Bloc is facing. And that is Russia and China as great powers or near-peer competitors to the United States. And of course, North Korea and Iran as regional revisionist powers that supplement some of the ambitions and capabilities of those great powers. So the challenge with Iran, of course, is that it never really sought to fully change that image. It was greatly akin to putting lipstick on a pig back in 2003, 4, 5. What you've seen now with the ultra hardline consolidation in Tehran, more public ballistic missile testing, more public ballistic missile transfers, more public ballistic missile use, and the deepening of its footprint through material support for Russia in the war in Ukraine, is that they're actually quite comfortable showing their face, this face, to the world, because they fear that they understand that there will be no response. Look back in 2013, the way some of the pro-Iran voices sold the Rouhani cabinet as having the highest number of Western PhDs in the Middle East. Now look at the Iranian cabinet today. And the Raisi cabinet is the most sanctioned cabinet in the history of the Islamic Republic. That is an achievement. Over 40% of those cabinet members, including ministers and executive vice presidents, are subject to some kind of international sanction.
Unbelievable. Irina, back to you in New York. Looking at Russia, if we would have thought a year ago about such a war, we would say that Russia would win it easily using its own force. I bet for Moscow to rely on, in such scale, on Tehran, on Iran, on foreign forces, that's not a huge reason for national pride.
No, it is quite embarrassing, and in fact, to the extent that the Western intelligence agencies underestimated the level of corruption and weakness inside Russia, it would be fair to say that to some extent even the Russian government underestimated the level of corruption in its own military. We have seen and heard rumors about the discrepancies about what the Kremlin has projected in terms of its rhetoric, and the surprise upon discovery that uniforms were missing, that the wrong tires have been bought, which caused some of the supply chain issues in Ukraine for the delivery trucks. That the pilots were not combat ready, not sufficiently trained. All of that came to a surprise to Kremlin, which raises a good question. To what extent has Kremlin been in control of its own military, of its own defenses, to the extent Putin and his close circles were not aware of their own weaknesses? That makes them vulnerable to other actors, including Iran. It makes them vulnerable to pressure, and it makes them less likely to take any drastic measures, actually, because they are not prepared. They have seen the lack of preparation for conventional combat, and they don't want any more surprises on their own end.
Yes, and if I ask you about the Ukrainian point of view, what they are trying to achieve currently, seeing themselves attacked on a daily basis by Iranian ammunition, Iranian weaponry, and having no one practically assisting them, defending them from this threat.
While Ukraine is in a better position now than Israel once was when it battled for its own survival, it's certainly in its own way meeting similar challenges. Russia was supposed to be this overwhelming force invading a country that was trying, a relatively young country that is trying to reform, trying to move towards the West, and it has no choice but not only to survive, but to emerge victorious.
So Behnam, back to you. I want to touch, to use the fact that you're here with us and touch another topic, and that's the riots we're seeing in the past few weeks in Tehran. You know, we Westerners look at it one way. How do they look at it in Tehran, and how successful or not successful is it when we look on previous rounds of riots that took place since, let's say, the Green Revolution, which never took place in 2009 onwards?
Well, I would certainly call every social street movement from 2017 to present, which represents a clear break from the older pro-reform movements of 1999 and 2009. 2017 to present, you've had the Iranian people use every potential opportunity, particularly non-political opportunities, to come onto the street to make a larger political point that they are done with the government of the Islamic Republic, that they want a government with views, values, and interests actually representative of their own. And in different iteration of protest after another, labor strike after another, they have been violently suppressed and put down, including in November 2019, after a 6 to 7 day internet blackout, 1,500 Iranians were killed by this regime using weapons of war. And still Iranians continue to come out and protest as they have now. The most recent round was triggered by the brutal killing of 22-year-old Iranian Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini. We're on week 5 of this now. This is historic for basically an unarmed population to continue to contest that kind of a state with that kind of a security force apparatus merely by staying on the streets and slowly starting to widen out strikes. So it is critical to actually call it what it is. It's not a riot. It's not a rebellion. It's a continuous move for a revolution. Whether or not this one succeeds, time will tell. But whether it ends tomorrow or whether it ends with the end of the Islamic Republic years later, one thing is certain: this is not the last gasp of the Iranian people's attempt to actually have a representative government. And you see it in the geography, in the demography, and in particular in the slogans of these brave protesters.
And how nervous about it is the regime?
Quite nervous. And in fact, while we've had analysis paralysis, you could say, in the West here, calling it, oh, this is an economic protest, oh, this is a food protest, oh, this is a hijab protest, oh, this is a social protest. The regime actually rightly diagnosed all of these 2017 to present protests as gunning for the heart of the regime, which is sadly why they have actually managed to so quickly localize and black out the internet and use this kind of violent force. So they have diagnosed it as a threat to themselves. The question is, where will the West be on this in the future?
We will stick to that question, I bet, more than once in the near future. Behnam bin Taleblu in Washington, Irina Zuckerman in New York. Thank you both so much for joining us today.